Good evening, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Free Library of Philadelphia, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this evening, Democracy in Danger. You know, the Free Library of Philadelphia is a neutral, nonpartisan, tax-supported institution, and that is why our obligations include providing a town square, a safe place for the people of Philadelphia to express themselves and their ideas. I think that we have a responsibility also to convene community meetings just like this one in times of grave national concern. We're honored tonight to have with us 4 of the best informed and most thoughtful Philadelphia civic leaders. You have their complete bios in your program, but I would just like to acknowledge them now. And we're talking about Bill Marrazzo, who is the president and CEO of WHYY, Al Schmidt, who is the president and CEO of the Committee of 70, James Greenwood, who served 6 terms as a Republican Congressman from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District, and Julia Taruso, who in this very dark and difficult time covers politics for the Philadelphia Inquirer. It is not an easy assignment. Now, I don't think that any of us mistakes the tenor of the times in which we live. It was not long ago that there was a violent insurrection in America's capital. Over the last few years, 2 members of Congress were shot and seriously injured. And I'm referring now to Steve Scalise, a Republican member from Louisiana, as well as the woman from Arizona, who was so badly injured that she was forced to give up her lifetime dream of serving in Congress. Well, what about the men and women who are still serving now? I think that no matter which side of the partisan aisle they're on, they're having to endure a level of insult, intimidation, and fear that has no background, no history in our country. And it's a deeply, deeply disturbing thing. And if you want to talk about a really controversial member of Congress, and I'm thinking of AOC, things have gotten so bad that she's been forced to hire a private security firm to provide security for herself and her family 24 hours a day. Things are so bad that, like Yasser Arafat or Chairman Mao many, many decades ago, she never sleeps in the same space 2 nights in a row. I think that is a terrible commentary on the state of America. I'm reminded that 40 days before the American Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln said this: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of our affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone in this broad land shall yet increase the chorus of the Union, when again are touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." So with that as a jumping off point, I'd like to begin by asking all our panel members a pretty tough question. I think that there are currently thousands of Americans who feel angry, embittered, they're disconnected from the larger society in which they live. They feel ignored and disrespected. And so I would like to ask our experts, what can be done to bring these folks back into the mainstream of American political life.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out to an event like this and caring enough about it to spend your evening here. One thing I do want to say is that it has been worse. I read a book recently called Field of Blood, and I recommend it to you. It's about the 3 decades leading to the Civil War and what it was like in the United States Congress, where most, if not all, members were carrying guns and knives into the chamber. There were fistfights constantly. There were duels. There was bloodshed, and so it's not as bad as that right now. But we may be headed there. I think that much of what we're experiencing now is really a phenomenon of media and primarily the internet. When the internet first came about, I thought this is the most miraculous, wonderful thing ever. Well, everyone in the world will have access to information, to facts, to truth, and we'll be able to join as a global community all around this great knowledge. And it has turned out that there's a lot of that that's available. But of course, it's now the case that people go to places on the internet and to cable television shows that confirm their bias and allow them to live in separate factual universes, and heartily believe what they find there. And people are incredibly misinformed, and then add in the fact that the Russians are intentionally trying to disrupt our democracy by planting false information and divisive information on the internet. So one thing that I think, there are a lot of things we can do, we can talk about, but one thing that I think is crucial is in the age when we have so much information available to us, so much misinformation available to us. The most important thing for anyone to learn at any age is how to tell truth from fiction, how to go onto the internet and not just believe everything that they see, but figure out, how do I, as a 5-year-old, I mean, it's fine to teach a 5-year-old that 2 and 2 is 4, but if the internet says 2 and 2 is 5, you've lost them. And so, I think that is the single most important thing we have to do as a society, is to teach people throughout their education how to navigate this tsunami of information and be able to come out of that process with some confidence that what they're believing is true.
Can't quite see you all. Good evening. You guys have a great view behind us, don't you? Before I attempt to answer this rich question, as Julia and I were talking earlier, I used to chair the board here at the Free Library of Philadelphia, so it's joyful to be back in this space again, and particularly in the context of using the Free Library as a location where we can come together to have civilized dialogue and civilized discussion. It's nice behind us. Thanks for having us. What I was attempting to suggest is how critically important it is to have a Free Library of Philadelphia across the entire city, not just here on Logan Circle, where we can come together as a civilized group of citizens to have conversation. My answer to your question really rests in the belief that we've lost our ability to have differences of opinion without being disagreeable. And I think we really need to practice new behaviors to appreciate the differences amongst us, actually enrich us, and put our guns back in their holster.
Hi, it's great to be with you all this evening, and especially in this room. The only time I've ever been in this room before was when I was city commissioner working with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, because new Americans are made in this room. Every couple of months, USCIS does naturalization ceremonies right here, and we lurk right outside that door with voter registration forms to register them the moment that they leave the room. And it's really gratifying because it's probably at least 95% who register right on the spot. And their party affiliation isn't sort of like out of whack with the rest of the city at all or anything like that. but they really appreciate that right. And that right is very much under threat right now, the ability to cast your vote in a democratic society. About on two years ago, which feels like yesterday, about a third of Americans did not have confidence in election results in America. 2 years later, about a third of Americans don't have confidence in election results in America. And that's even after what occurred on January 6th. It's after all the litigation that came our way and throughout the country that was very decisive, was decided by frequently, in our case, federal judges that were Republican judges, and I'm a Republican, by the way, Republican judges, and including Republican judges that were appointed by the former president, still threw all those cases out because they had no basis in fact. And that is, basis in fact is, I think, the real problem that we're facing right now. Because my impulse has been that I have to fight every day to be dismissive and to be condescending about those concerns, because those concerns have no basis in fact. But nevertheless, people believe them. And I think in terms of the message, and I agree with our other panelists here, in terms of the message, the way we deliver that message is important, and that we need to be compassionate and we need to be understanding, because many of these people, and I have for the past 2 years gone to Republican events to answer people's questions, to hear them out, and to just go right down the line of everything they have heard and have concerns about and all the rest. But I think the way in which we deliver the message is every bit as important as the message, in understanding that many of these people are decent people and they love America and they believe that they're right. They are not. But nevertheless, it's important that we engage with that 30% of America and try to answer their questions. And also at the same time, not take the 70% for granted, and to make sure the 70% maintain their confidence in our electoral system. So I agree with the message, and I'm just chiming in, suggesting that the way in which we deliver that message and the way in which we engage people with whom we disagree is very important, I think, to getting us out of this.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's a really tough time to be a reporter. It's a really tough time to be a political reporter. Al just mentioned 30% of Americans believing, the election results weren't accurate. I think it's about a quarter or more of people who don't trust the media and who, listen to a president who called us the enemy of the people. So we're up against a lot, and people do, they go to get their news from the cable news stations and newspapers that speak to them. My dad is here tonight, and when I told him I wanted to get into journalism, we watched movies like The Paper and Absence of Malice, and I love those movies, but they make me a little sad now because I wish I was a reporter in, the 80s or something. How do we reach those communities? I do think that local, hyper-local reporters are still the most trusted. If I'm showing up at your school board meeting or your local, county council meeting, and I'm reporting accurately on what happened there, you're going to be more inclined to trust me and to trust the paper I work for. Unfortunately, those are the media organizations that are suffering the most. I think investigative reporting is often, and I'm answering this question from my career and my position, but is often a unifying type of journalism. The big things that get uncovered that unite everybody, that think wrongs should be righted and corruption should be called out. And from our perspective, after President Trump won the election, a lot of reporters were like, what happened? I guess we're not talking to half of America. And I don't know that we've really done enough to remedy that. partly because half of America doesn't want to talk to us. But, I think it is our responsibility to do a better job of explaining what we do, who we work for, and even just how the process works. I talk to people all the time who assume that my editor tells me exactly what to write and tells me what I can and can't publish. So I think it is talking to people, listening to them, the hard work of even just explaining kind of behind the curtain what we do.
I wanted to follow up on something that Congressman Greenwood said. He was talking about the importance of civility. And, that made me think that when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s at least, members of Congress were just as intense about their political and philosophical beliefs as they are now. But once the sun went down and people were no longer doing the people's business, they socialized. They enjoyed spending time together. There were a lot of across the aisle friendships. And my impression is that a lot of those people knew and respected each other, even though they continued to disagree on matters of political principle. What the heck changed, and what, if anything, can we do about it?
Well, I guess that's for me. One of the things that is often misunderstood about that phenomenon is as follows. The Democrats controlled the House of Representatives from 1954 to 1994. And for most of that time, the Republicans considered themselves hopelessly in the minority. And the Senate was majority Democrat for most of those years as well, I think minus about 6. And so basically what happened is if you were a Republican in those days, you socialized because you weren't going to beat these guys anyway. So it was good to be friendly with them, and maybe they'd help you get a bill passed or help you get a bridge built in your district or something, help you get reelected because they were happy to have you reelected because you weren't a threat. Then along came Newt Gingrich. Now everybody blames Newt Gingrich for the lack of civility, and he'll deserve some of that. But here's what happened. When the Republicans, I was elected in 1992, and in 1994, the Republicans took the majority. That was a huge shock to the Democrats, particularly to the old bulls who had chaired the committees for a very long time. There was no time limit on how long they could chair the committees. And so that began sort of the desperate attempt by both parties to gain and regain majorities. And so from that point forward, it was no more like, oh yeah, help the freshman kid get a bill passed from the other party. No, we want to beat that freshman kid. So we're not going to be helpful to him. We're not going to be nice to him. So it became much more a matter of hard fought political battles every 2 years. So that's one of the things that has changed the situation. Now, having said that, in the 12 years that I was there, I left in 2000, at the end of 2004. I like to say I left undefeated, unindicted, which I thought was a great accomplishment. But when I was there, there were moderate. I'm a moderate, very moderate, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-gun control, pro-environment Republican. I'm the last one on the planet. But we had a group called the Tuesday Group, and that was the moderate Republicans. And I was the chair of that for a while. And I could walk into Gingrich's office or Speaker Hastert's office and say, this bill isn't going to go anywhere until it moves to the center. Now the Republican Study Committee goes into the speaker and says, this bill isn't going to go anywhere until it moves to the right. So that's what has happened in terms of the parties moving to the extremes of the left and moving to the extremes of the right. And it's another reason why there's lack of civility, because it used to be that there are charts where you would look at Republicans and Democrats and how often they voted together. And there was a whole lot of overlap. There was a lot of times that moderate Republicans voted for Democratic bills and vice versa. Over the last 20, 30 years, it's gone like that. And there's almost no overlap. And so that's another factor.
Can I chip in on that? We're a former colleague of mine still here, Cokie Roberts. She would love your question. When she, as a young woman, moved with her family to Washington, DC, her father was a congressman, right? They moved in time to get into DC before the school year started. They spent the entire school year, 10 months, inside of the Beltway. As your question suggests, she would tell us that every night after Congress adjourned, they would all get together regardless of party affiliation and socialize. They would worship together. They'd go bowling together. And they developed a sense of mutual respect for one another, even though they had vast differences of partisan view. And she would say, in response to your question, the thing that changed it all was the ability to democratize the commercial airline industry. When it became possible in the late 60s on a cost-effective basis for every elected official in Washington to fly back to their home district almost every night. And for Pete's sakes, today we had a president in the White House who built his personal political brand on taking the train home every night for good reason to be with his young family. So there's a certain amount of infrastructure implication, I think, in response to your question. There really isn't a social infrastructure that keeps our elected officials together in DC.
I could just add one quick thing. Not only could they fly back and forth, but politically they had to, because members were being challenged. Congressman so-and-so never comes back here to Montana. He's always inside the Beltway. And so they all felt compelled to get home as much as they could on the weekends to be with their constituents.
I want to offer an opinion now, and I also want to be very careful about it. So I want to say right out of the chute that this is a personal opinion of mine and not an opinion of the Free Library or its employees. I think that we've done an absolutely terrible job of teaching government or civics, or perhaps we should call it citizenship. I'm not sure what has gone wrong here, but it's very clear that something has, because even on something as basic as how an American president is elected in these days seems to be so shrouded in confusion and facts and misstatements and half facts. I'd like the entire panel to respond. What sort of ideas do you have about what we could do differently in terms of educating young people in particular about government or civics or whatever you would want to call it?
Okay. Well, again, speaking from the news industry, I think we have to be realistic about who our readers are. And if we want to reach younger readers, we have to do more explanatory journalism. We have to kind of, when the fake electors story first came out, we have to take a step back and say, like, hey, is there a way to reach people who aren't familiar with how we elect a president and why this is a big issue and what is happening? And I've seen that happen increasingly at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm happy about it, whether it's how to vote or, what you should know about ballot questions or, embracing more of a role as civic informants. And, I think that's a really important first step. And we also have to meet people where they are. I mean, I spoke to a freshman political science class, I think it was in the spring, and those students didn't understand kind of like, so all of your stories are on a website, they're getting their news on TikTok, they're getting their news elsewhere, they're smart kids, but we have to be realistic about where they are and find ways to meet them where they are.
Before I answer this, I just want to add one very quick thing to the last question, that along with all those other changes, you also had the increasing surgical precision of gerrymandering, allowing people to get elected in districts that are more and more homogeneous and less of a need to appeal to anyone else outside of their base. That's probably also just one other factor in the mix of all that. You know, one thing that that we've done over the years is measure turnout by age cohort. And turnout is really determined, like when you hear the word turnout, it's the number of people who are registered to vote versus the number of people who actually cast a vote. Not the number of people who are eligible to register to vote, but who is actually registered to vote. And one surprising thing we've seen in the 18 to 34-year-old, 18 to 34-year-old age cohort is how low that turnout is. So they're registered to vote, but not voting. And there's a real disconnect there. And then they vote sometimes in great numbers. So they have the ability to really have a terrific impact on election results when they do show up to vote, but they're registered. They're just not being, there's a disconnect there with them feeling like their vote counts or something that's motivating them to actually come out to vote. So it's a huge potential universe of voters who are registered, but are only very intermittently engaging in the political process.
So on the civics issue, I do think that should be, when I studied civics when I was in high school at some point. We had a civics class and we learned how America works, and we learned things like what is propaganda and how do you tell truth from fiction, all that. So I think it should be mandatory in every school district. That what could be more fundamental in democracy than to actually understand how it works. So I think that the gerrymandering issue was very much on point. It used to be that an election like we're having now, a midterm election, or any election where the House of Representatives every 2 years, it used to be something from 130 to 150 seats could be sort of considered toss-up seats. Now with gerrymandering, as was said, overwhelmingly the districts are so unbalanced that I could tell you right now, probably of the 435 seats that are up this year in 2 weeks, how 400 of those races are going to come out. There are only 30 or so, 30 some where it's actually in question. So when you're in one of those 400 rather relatively lopsided seats and you want to go to Congress, you probably have to beat an incumbent of your own party, because you can't win if you're in the other party. So to beat an incumbent of your own party, what you have to do is assume that in a primary election, it tends to be the more further right and the more further left at turnout. So if you're Republican, you have to run to the right of the incumbent. If you're Democrat, you have to run to the left of the incumbent, and so on and so on. And so that has contributed mightily to the polarization, because we keep getting, and then what happens is the primaries occur, and then in the general election, people go, how did we get these two nutcases as our candidates? And the answer is because you didn't vote in the primary. That's how we got those people there. So you know, that's a real issue.
You want full participation on this. So I'll say personally, I think Jim is right. I think civics ought to be a mandatory element in our educational system, and not necessarily for any other reason, but that it's a privilege to live in a democracy of the sort that we have here in this country. And young people need information to encourage them to participate fully. Can I get a plug in here for something?
Please
HYY?
do.
Yeah. So 2.5 years ago, in the face of what is a dire absence of civic understanding amongst young children, particularly in elementary school, middle school, we launched an animated cartoon series called Your Democracy, which is distributed in a digital format, not just direct through HYY, but also in partnership with the National Constitution Center, targeted for those middle school kids to understand the nuances of our United States Constitution and the benefit of participating fully as voters when they become eligible.
Because we have a couple of very committed Republicans on this panel and probably some pretty committed Republicans in this audience, I'd like to ask a question. And I think the best way to put it is this. For many years, it was absolutely clear what the Republican Party stood for, which is less government, balanced budgets, a willingness to project American power overseas for a good cause. And yet when I look at what the Republican Party stands for today, I'm sort of hesitant to say that any of these things are true. And I'm just wondering where all the traditional Republicans who believed in the, in the things that I mentioned, where these people are supposed to go or what they're supposed to do now.
So I am a registered Democrat. But the older I've gotten, the more I think like I think the old Republican Party, right? I'd love to meet the person who invented on CNN the red state, blue state game. Yeah, when whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago, to analyze the voting trends inside of our country. I think it was CNN, Julia, you may need to correct me. Devise this simple way to you put people in buckets as Democrats or as Republicans. Oversimplified it in my judgment, I guess, is the point I'm trying to get to. And I am troubled as a member of the media industry that, with the exception of our good colleagues here on the panel, too many journalists, I think, have gotten seduced into oversimplifying the complexities of the extremes of our two parties, each of which I think represent terribly different points of view, but to the same end, to create wealth, to create jobs, to create quality of life. One is, as you suggest in your question, I guess your old Republican Party way is to have a small federal government with little intrusion in the day-to-day lives of people, in the spirit of creating a sense of freedom for people to accomplish all those good ends. I think we have long ago in the media lost our understanding of the fundamental differences between Republicans, little r, Democrats, little d. I think it goes all the way back to the founding of our Constitution, if I recall my history lessons, when there was a raging debate right here in Philadelphia about whether or not we should erect our country around a small or an expansive form of government, a perfectly legitimate debate that I think we should still have today, but we never do because I think the media has gotten soft and narrates the differences between Republicans, Democrats on a personality basis, not on a philosophical basis.
Listening to what Bill just said made me wonder if there were additional political parties in this country, would that make the situation better or worse in the opinion of panel members?
So as a lifelong Republican who voted for every Republican president, I think from Nixon to Romney, and then raised $2 million for Joe Biden and raised $175,000 for Shapiro, I'll talk a little bit about why I was a Republican and maybe why I'm not voting Republican anymore. But my political theory is that societies work best when individuals have the maximum amount of freedom and the maximum amount of accountability. And so I believe in things like the work ethic, but I believe that there are people who cannot succeed in the workplace and they need to be cared for and helped to become productive. So I'm not opposed to social welfare programs. I think they should be run prudently and carefully and devoid as possible of incentivizing the wrong thing and also of fraud. I believe the free enterprise system is key to the leadership that we have in the world and is very important with all of the necessary regulations to protect a whole variety of values. But what happened to and I could go on about what Republicans, the notion that it's a good thing to make as many decisions as close to the community as possible because it's harder to affect a policy in Washington than it is to affect one in your city or in your locality or in your state even. So there's some value to have many decisions and policies formulated at a more local and state level. But what happened is Trump. And the notion that Republicans, the reason I ran for Congress was to balance the budget. And we got very close to it. And we thought we were going to solve that problem. Republicans cared all about balancing the budget until Trump came on and just blew the deficit to hell. And they're getting all ready to care about balancing the budget again and not spending as soon as they have the majorities at least in the House. Trump, the Republicans tended to believe in free trade and that it was a good thing to have products made in places where they can be less expensive because all consumers globally then have access to lower prices and so forth. Trump, blew that away. And so the Republican Party now is essentially a captive of Donald Trump. He has figured out how to make his supporters and his base so virulently angry that any Republican who defies him does so, Liz Cheney, at her own peril. And so that's what has changed the Republican Party. And as long as Trump is a factor in the body politics, and he still obviously is, I don't know how the Republican Party is going to get back to the values that once made it a real contender in the debate about issues and ideas.
Dick, you described us as being committed Republicans, and I'm sure there are many people here who think we should be committed for being Republicans. And I in the 2020 election, running elections here, like many election administrators across the country, Democrats and Republicans were on the receiving end of a lot of just terrible stuff, like people threatening to kill my children and sending messages with their names and our address and pictures of our home and all of that stuff. But that doesn't make me feel more like a Democrat. It just makes me feel more estranged from members of my own party that has been largely, I feel, taken over because that 30% that I mentioned before is really 70% of the Republican Party at present. And that's played out in primary election after primary election across the country. So oftentimes, I feel, and I'm sure others do as well, like you don't really have a home. And one reason why you probably don't have a home is because our political system, which is designed in a very stable way, we just have two parties. We don't have 18 with majorities that rise and fall and all the rest like many in Europe have, that you're going to be forced into largely one of those two parties, especially in states like ours, where in our Commonwealth, you have to be registered in a party in order to vote in the primary election. So you're kind of like corralled into one of two parties, even if you don't adhere, certainly down the line, especially for me, at least, as the Republican Party continues to embrace populism, which I find to be an extremely dangerous road to go down. And without drawing too many parallels, that embrace of populism throughout history has proven to be a very dangerous thing.
I'll just add quickly, I spend a lot of time talking to undecided voters. And I've actually heard it from folks in that category in both parties, that the more kind of radical the pitches get on both sides, the more they just want to tune everything out. And that the shouting match and the, high school football game that feels like they're watching really makes them retreat and feel like they don't have a home. So that's eye-opening to me as someone who, is often covering the horse race, is often covering the back and forth. And, when two people have such different ideas, it's hard for me to even understand how someone could be undecided. But I think that's a lot of what's happening for a lot of people.
And just to echo one thing you said, Julia, is it shows itself in voter registration activity. Like the number of people registering to vote who are registering to vote neither Democratic nor Republican in states where you can only vote in primaries if you're registered in one of those parties is really through the roof. And it's not going on just here, it's going on throughout the country where new voters are not registering with a party. The New Americans I mentioned before, overwhelmingly not registered either party affiliation, selecting either independent or unaffiliated when they register to vote. So that's a trend going on across America that's really only been increasing in the last 10 years.
In an effort, I guess, to be provocative, I wanted to talk a little bit about Belgium, which as far as I can tell with limited knowledge, is one of the unhappiest and least successful countries in the world, in part because you have these two very different ethnic communities and cultures which are yoked together and can't really escape one another. And as a result, I think based on some of the things I've read, it seems that the country is almost a disaster and frequently fails to function at all. And I was thinking about this in the context of red America and blue America, and I'm wondering if that's a potential possibility for us. Could we down the road wind up as the Belgium of North America?
So Dick, I felt totally unprepared for this debate, but my PhD is in European history. So I finally feel in my entire professional career ready for this question that I am undoubtedly going to flub. But Belgium is interesting to look at, and other countries like it that are multi-ethnic democracies. And throughout history, it's been very difficult for multi-ethnic democracies to sort of hold together. Ours is different from Belgium, especially in the sense that it's diverse, but sort of geographically homogenous. And we don't really have that other than big cities and rural counties. So we're not, unlike the references to the Civil War earlier, we don't have like a geographic boundary beyond cities and not cities. But I think that part of our American experiment that we are, and I think we're in a critical juncture in our history right now, and I don't think there's anyone who disagrees with that, regardless of your party affiliation, is going to determine whether a multi-ethnic democracy is capable of surviving the strains that it's currently undergoing.
So a question that was asked that wasn't answered was the one about what if we had more parties? And yeah, I think it's really a mixed bag. So if you look at third parties, they historically in this country have gotten 2 or 3% of the vote, but they've also been spoilers, right? So what was the guy who ran for president and from Texas, the guy with the big ears? Ross Perot. So Ross Perot probably got Bill Clinton elected, right? Because he took votes from Bush 41. And then Ralph Nader probably took the election away from Gore because of the votes he took in Florida that would have tipped the scale. So there's that impact of third and fourth parties. The other thing is, if you want to look at a case of multi-party countries, look at Israel and how many elections they've had in the past several years, and the fact that when you have all those parties, if you have a parliamentary system like they do, it has some value. But the other thing that happens is the tail wags the dog. So you have the extreme parties having to coalesce with, they get this inordinate amount of power.
I wanted to say something about facts, because it seems to me that traditionally, historically, America has been a fact-based culture, a place where being right, being sure, doing your homework, finding out what was really true, those were considered to be very important values. And I remember hearing, I think, the first time that President Trump's aide, Kellyanne Conway, made a reference to alternative facts. And I said to myself, what is she talking about? I thought that there were facts and lies. So one of the things that's happened recently, I think, is that we're no longer a culture that seems to respect and appreciate facts. People used to be proud to say that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. What do you think has happened to us, and what can we do about it?
I think people are still factual, but not necessarily truthful. And I think we've developed a pattern of, particularly in political coverage, of cherry picking facts to create a new truth. If I really went out on a limb here tonight, I would say as well that pretty much like every other sector of our economy, I think politics now too is part of the entertainment industry. And when you need to entertain people, sometimes the raw facts isn't enough. I think you need to kind of put the facts on steroids and create some fantasy or some new truths. And I think a lot of what distresses me, at least, and I certainly know it distresses our newsroom, is to try to figure out ways, and it's tough, to remain factual when there's these other truths that keep getting in the way from other media outlets.
I think there are two components to this. One of them is the guys like Hannity and Tucker Carlson and whatever her name is, Laura Ingraham, or name her is. I think they quite deliberately know that the cable TV industry is all about ratings, and ratings is about how many eyeballs you can get. And Fox leads because they feed people what they want to hear, not what they need to know. So they are, in my mind, they are a real corruption on our society because they deliberately, for fattening their wallets, spew whatever it takes to draw the audience. On the other hand, the other component of that is the people who are watching that show and getting misinformation and believing it. So I don't think most Americans walk around thinking that they're saying things that aren't true about our society. I think they believe them, but as I said in the very beginning, the problem is the people are being fed misinformation. They believe that it's true. They absolutely believe that it's true, and then they live their lives accordingly. And then they encounter someone who has a countervailing view. They think that person is crazy and sick and lying. And a perfect example of this I just was reading about today. So, you know, Fetterman, bless his crushed little soul after last night, but you know, his whole rap against him is he's just letting murderers out on the streets, and the wild, who in their right mind would run all these wild murderers, you know, running around. If you look at the cases, because he's a lieutenant governor who serves on the parole board, these are instances where like somebody is like 75 years old. They committed a murder, you know, maybe they were 18 or 20 years old from whatever childhood caused that to happen, right? And they've been on good behavior. They're sick. They're costing us a fortune to have in jail. They're not going to hurt anybody. They can barely walk. And so some of those people, you know, deserve, you know, no matter what they did and what caused them to do that, deserve some chance, I think, at that point in their lives to breathe a little fresh air, get out of the pen and die in some kind of, you know, peaceful way. But that's not, you know, that's not what the media and the Hannitys and so forth are feeding the citizens.
Well, and I think to go off of that, the problem is, you know, we are explaining to readers what the parole board does and how that's different from, you know, Larry Krasner's conviction integrity unit. And these are complex things that we're trying to explain, but the people who are believing misinformation or disinformation gave up reading us a long time ago. So, you know, we're very purposeful about, you know, correcting these things where we see them. Even putting, I remember when there was the push to audit the vote in Pennsylvania, we refused to call it an audit because it didn't follow the definition of what a legitimate audit is. And we put a little box in our stories that said the Inquirer is not using the term audit because of this. So sometimes it feels like a losing battle, because sometimes it feels like we're kind of preaching to the people who already, yeah.
Just to chime in very quickly on it, and I commend you for quoting one of my heroes, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, just a moment ago. No civilized conversation could take place in which he's not quoted in one way or another. But I mentioned before about going around and talking to Republicans who believe the election was stolen. And one thing that I've encountered again and again is that it doesn't really matter what the facts are. In fact, the last meeting I went to, the one guy sat back, threw his hands up in the air and said, and I quote, "Forget about the facts. I know Biden didn't win." Which is hard to disagree with, like in terms of like actually engaging someone who has that position. But one kind of theory that I have that's going to sound kind of wacky is that one reason why I don't think the facts matter in all this is I don't know that that 30% actually believes the election was stolen. I feel like the question of whether whether Donald Trump won or lost and whether that election was stolen or not is really, in a way, a litmus test for, are you going to stand up to the liberal Democrats who are destroying our country, who are trying to do something to your kids, who are trying to teach them all sorts of things that are alien to you or you oppose, and that it is not, in fact, about facts at all. It's not really about ballots or any of that in the 2020 election. It's that no matter what, are you going to fight them? Even in the face of bold-faced lies, are you still going to stand there and oppose the liberal Democrats and what they're trying to do to America, no matter what? And that is maybe far-fetched, but it's the only thing that, in my experience, has explained what we're encountering.
And that's the real threat. The real threat is when enough voters decide that what's more important is the policy than the process. In other words, if I win, fine. But if I lose, then we're going to overthrow the government because I wanted to win. I want my side to win. And there's no such thing anymore for that ilk of people to say, okay, we lost this one. Let's see how we have to alter our message to win the next election instead of let's just deny that we lost.
I appreciate the opportunity to have my say, but I think now is the time for you to have yours. So do we have a mic that yes, we do. Okay. And this gentleman in the back here has a question.
I'm sorry. My name is Jamal. It's good to meet you guys. I'm so honored to be here. Really appreciate you guys. I don't know if I really seen you guys sometime in my travels, but maybe I did, but maybe I didn't. But my question is for Mr. James C. Greenwood. The first question was asked about how we can get people back into politics from so much of confusion that may be happening. And I wanted to go over, is it possible you would tell me a little bit more about that question?
So do you mean, is it Jamal? Do you mean, how do we get more people to get involved in politics and run for office? Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question. I think it's a hard one to, I don't know that I know the answer to that. I think that those of us who have any voice in our community need to constantly encourage that. We need to encourage young people to get involved. And it's hard to get kids involved, young people involved, when they look and see what the system looks like today. That's the problem. The kids look at it, young people look at it and they go, who wants to play in that game? It's brutal, it's ugly. It's vicious. I don't want to do that. And so, part of the process is we've got to make the system more credible so that people who might think about having a career, or at least spending some of their lives in elective office, feel like it's something worth doing and that they can actually have an impact there.
Okay, let's wait until we can get a mic over here to the gentleman here.
I was just at the Friends Select School in their theater this past week, where high school students were invited in to have a discussion with Helen Gim, who was brought in by a class. And I thought those teenagers were very affected by having a real life politician speak to them face to face and take their questions and so forth.
I spent a lot of time when I was public office going to the schools. I would go to elementary schools and divide the class into Republicans and Democrats, and then we would write ideas for bills on the chalkboard, and we'd pick one and we'd say, okay, you try to get that bill passed. So yeah, that's why leaders can, and I think more elected officials sort of spend more time in the schools, K through 12.
So the gentleman in the cap here.
So there's a move amongst the Democratic Party, of which I am a member, to lower the voting age to 16. And I would say, Commissioner Schmidt, how are you? Congressman, we need to increase the voting age back to 21. Because now you have campaigns that are run based not on discourse, not on dialogue, not on debate, but on emotions. And everybody is now voting on emotions instead of facts. This is why you can't get to the facts. So the cognitive development of a male, according to the medical literature, is 25 years of age. And now we're talking about a political party who wants to lower the voting age to 16.
I think you addressed at least you addressed me and the gentleman there. So one thing I remember when the voting age was reduced, the argument was, if I'm old enough to go to war, I should be able to vote for the people who would send me there. So I mean, that's a real argument. Yeah, just let me finish and then I'll yield. The other just political reality is, if you're going to ask members of the state legislature or members of Congress to vote to raise the age, good luck with that, because until it's raised, everybody between 18 and 21 will vote against them, and they're going to be terrified of that prospect.
All right, they're not going to get a vote because they didn't get a vote on the first one. And the reason, because I'm of that era, the real reason that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and his crew and those white college kids wanted the voting age rate dropped to 18 had nothing to do with voting. It had to do with being able to drink legally. That's what it had to do with. They weren't going to Vietnam anyway. The government knew that the draft was going to end and become voluntary. The government knew that they were withdrawing from Vietnam when all that was changed. So there are 3 golden rules of politics, Congressman, correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm speaking as the grandson.
Sir, I think it's time to give somebody else a chance. And there's a lady here who had a question.
Yeah, so thank you to the panel for being here. I just wanted to address Al specifically. Thank you so much for everything you did for this city in 2020. Round of applause. I know we might disagree on a lot, but the courage that it took for you to stand up on behalf of the city brings me to tears. So thank you. My question is, I look around this room, forgive me for being crass, but I'm one of the younger people here. My generation and those younger than me, we're going to be the ones saddled with the repercussions of what's happening in this country. The thing I cannot put my finger on is, why do we continue to let money impact our politics? So what can we do to get around Citizens United? Because in the last 10 years, it seems that Citizens United has continued to degrade the political ads. So we're talking about civics, the things that we see on TV. I'm watching the World Series with my 9-year-old nephew, and he's seeing these ads that are just mean, blatantly mean. How do we get to a point where we say, screw Citizens United, we're not going to put billions of dollars that could feed the hungry man over here in, in Center City. We're going to put that into good and not into attack ads that are, essentially degrading society.
If I may, at the risk of sounding self-serving, WHYY will not take those ads for that reason.
I'll just respond. I think you're quite right about the impact of citizens, that case. The question is, and by the way, I spent 12 years in Congress and never took 1 penny from a political action committee. And everybody thought I was crazy. And I said, I could never buy the trust of my constituents that I get by not taking the money with the money if I took it. And I wish more people would understand that. But the problem is that's the Supreme Court decision, and they're interpreting it. They're interpreting the Constitution the way they believe the First Amendment should be interpreted. So unless you're going, until and unless you pack the Supreme Court and change the majority, or wait long enough for the majority to change in and of itself, which is a very long wait, I'm afraid that we're stuck with that.
Okay, let's see. Let's get the lady right up front here. Can we do that?
I think we're talking as if we're going to continue to be the society. And I'm frankly very frightened that our society is going to disappear. That if the Republicans take over the House and the Senate, if the election deniers across the country have their way, we're not going to have fact-loving people in office. And I feel the question is, can our democracy be saved? And I feel kind of scared. I'm much older than the young woman, but I have grandchildren who I worry about all the time. What kind of society are they going to grow up in? And it's very scary.
This gentleman here has a question. Oh, you know what? Let's go to him and then to this gentleman up in front.
I wanted to know, it seems to me like President Trump seemed to have touched a nerve with a segment of the population. I want the panelists to probably, if they can, bring it out, what is it that has made him touch that nerve with this? Because they seem not to, they are unmovable. They are still there. And no president before or after has ever been so dominant in the political sphere. So if we could identify that, then that probably is something that we've blindsided us, because we don't want to accept the truth that there's something wrong. And this man has tapped into that. And he's even for the negative result. So I want to know from.
Probably, it's an excellent question. Part of my theory about how Trump succeeded was that, and if you look at his base, it's very much this high school educated white blue collar workers, right? And a lot of them, a lot of it has to do with manufacturing leaving the country. A lot of it has to do with them not having the skills to compete in a technological society. They have been feeling badly and unhappy about their economic lot in life, and you can't blame them for that. I think, to be a bit of a psychologist, I think many of them had some self-blame, or maybe I should have studied more when I was in school. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe I should have taken a different job. Maybe I should have started a business or something. And so they have a certain amount of self-doubt, right? Along comes Donald Trump. He says, not your fault. It's the Mexicans. It's the people in Washington. It's the whatever it is. And so he blamed other people, and that put endorphins into their brain. That made them say, oh, it's not my fault. I love this guy. He's got it right. And so How are you going to fix that? I mean, one of the things we have to do is we have to help that group of people be more successful economically. We need programs for job training and whatever it takes, bringing jobs back to the United States so that ilk of people is not as subject to the leadership of somebody like Donald Trump.
Trump was talking about that. He was talking about bringing those jobs back. That's exactly what he was talking about, bringing the jobs back.
Yeah,
Community development.
I know that's what he was talking about, and that's why it appealed to them. Pardon me?
He was on point there, wasn't he?
No, but I
Julia
said-
has-
Yeah, no, I was just gonna,
Talking about it, Joe's talking about it now.
yeah.
Joe gave the jobs away. Look at his voting record in the Senate. All the roll call.
I was just gonna weigh in for a second. I think everything you just said, Congressman, is absolutely true. And I think, there's a reason Fetterman is running for forgotten communities. Democrats did not pay attention to what was happening in these areas where, industry had been crumpling for decades and people had been shifting to the Republican Party for decades, but they felt and were ignored by the party, and Trump tapped into that. And I think, that's a big part of kind of his strategy now. Whether it works or not, remains to be seen. So.
And I agree with you both, and I really think it is partially a matter of acknowledging what people have gone through. Like, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. The steel industry is not coming back to Western Pennsylvania. It won't in my lifetime. It won't in my children's lifetime. It will never, ever return to Western Pennsylvania. And that's a hard thing to accept. It's like curiously uncomfortable thing to say out loud. But I think you end up with this whole universe of people who feel like they're forgotten. And they're not, I don't know that they're actually believing that he or someone else is going to bring that back. It's more a matter of like, I hear you, I understand that you're suffering, and just acknowledging your existence and that you're sort of not forgotten, even if what he's saying is not, and others, is not going to happen ever.
One term I haven't heard tonight is class war. And I believe that when people don't accept facts, it's because it's my class against your class. And I look at the history of the United States. I look at Ken Burns when he talks about the United States during the Second World War. And there was this huge class change that people wanted one thing for the United States. You can go all the way back to the Revolution, where there were the Federalists, and there were two images of the country. And now when you talk about why is this happening now, there has been this hidden undercurrent that has been repressed all this time. And now suddenly President Trump and his ilk have brought this up and released it, Pandora's box, so to speak.
Thank you. I'm an educator of 40 years, and I just really want to say the schools cannot fix this. If you look at what happened the pandemic, kids are so behind in math and reading, and the cultural wars are playing out in the schools. Asking them to do civics will only make those cultural wars worse, and there is no room in the curriculum. So I want us to really, really think about where else can we do that kind of education? Where in our community do we find support for civility and the understanding of the role of citizenship? But let me just say, but I do have a question. I kind of considered the parties as having a job to control, in some ways, extreme measures. And why are there not more courage? There's a great resignation. People are leaving jobs all over the country to have more at their heart, do more things that they find meaningful. Why are the politicians so frightened and so power hungry that they're willing to allow this destruction to happen in plain view under their watch?
Should recalibrate questions for a second. Do any of you have any responses? And I want to make sure that I go back and forth between the room. So if there's other
I
questions.
think you have a question. One of your questions was, part of your question was, why is it that so many politicians are not showing the courage that you could say Liz Cheney showed to try to rein in the party? I think in many instances, it is just lack of courage. They're not willing to take the risk and lose their jobs. One of the rationale that they will give is, look, if I go against, let's say in this case, Trump, right? I'm going to lose my seat in the primary, even though I may be personally skeptical about him and maybe I don't vote with him all the time, but I'll lose my seat to someone who completely believes all of that hook, line, and sinker, and the country will be worse for that.
Just to add to it, it's all the more despicable because the net worth of members of Congress has never been higher than it is right now. So it's not like they're afraid of paying their mortgage or putting their kids through school or something like that. So that's clearly not the motive. I mean, it has to be sort of power and nothing more.
Mine isn't exactly a question. It's a response to what the woman who was said she was a teacher said. If there's limits to teaching math and reading, so you don't have time to teach civics, then use the math and reading to teach civics. Math class, look at elections. Use the election as a math for basic math lessons to learn about. It might not be the regular math, but it's a form of math, and it's something we need to know. Reading, civics. I can think of a dozen books in all sorts of age ranges that could teach basic politics and understanding it to kids and to older kids as well.
Adam, we have a gentleman up here who never had his chance.
Can you raise your hand? Sorry.
Yeah, just one comment in that I don't know why we're so surprised that people don't believe what we're saying. We've had generation, I'm 68, so the tail end of Vietnam, where friends were drafted and sent to a war that was based on a false premise. And a generation later, we had another president who took us into the Middle East in a war that lasted 21 years, really almost out of a personal vendetta to kind of finish what Dad had started. And so I'm really not surprised where there's a generation of people that are fellow voters who don't believe in the facts that I believe in. And I know the facts I believe in are right, and so do they. So the question is, do you guys see a way forward into establishing a source or finding a place where we can all look at and see a set of facts and come to different conclusions and come to different solutions perhaps on it? But will we ever have a point where there is a fact that we'll all believe?
I mean, it might sound naive, but I want to say support local journalism. You know, newsrooms are gutted. And if we had more people on the ground to go into communities, to talk to people, none of this is easy. But if, you know, I think, again, a difference between then and now is newspapers were more respected and were more trusted. And, you know, it's hard work, but funding more community-based reporting, funding more local reporting, and trying to rebuild that trust as best we can.
You know,
If I can, at the risk of talking too much, which I probably already broken that rule, but the question was, is there a place where we can go where people can find facts upon which they can agree so they don't have to? I had an idea, which was to create a reality TV show in which you put a Trump family and an anti-Trump family in the same house and had them live together for a year and cook meals and have their debates and so forth. And then kind of have a referee system. So when somebody says, well, you know, X is true, and somebody can say, well, let's take a look at that. And I thought it would be kind of cool because I thought it would be interesting. It would be, you know, to see all the clashes going on and so forth. It'd be like rooting for the one team to the other team. But when we talk to like a lot of the makers of TV programs like Netflix and all that, they basically said, They can't make anything unless it has a global audience. That's where they make their money, is when they franchise it out overseas, and they didn't think there would be interest in that outside of the US.
Just Julia, I wanted to echo something you said, and you also started this conversation with it, is going around the country and speaking to groups and organizations working to strengthen our democracy. Everyone has arrived at the conclusion that when it comes to trusted sources of information, the more local it is, the better. So you might be asked to be on CNN or MSNBC, but it doesn't matter at all. It's far better to be on 6ABC or local CBS or NBC 10 or whatever else, because that's not self-segregating by party affiliation. Like, Republicans don't watch NBC 10 and Democrats watch ABC.
Yeah. And people want to connect. I've been to lots of Trump rallies, and if I say I get a better reception and people will talk to me longer if I say, I'm a reporter from just a couple hours away in Philadelphia, or if I'm in Scranton and I say my dad went to the U, like, the people just want to feel like, okay, maybe I'll give you a chance. And sometimes that's all the opening you need to start a conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry. I read 2 newspapers a day, and I appreciate the papers. And I think the reason why a lot of people don't read the newspapers is because they think they're getting the news from all of the false information that is disseminated from the radios and televisions. But that's not my question. It's my bias. I am very interested to hear from people who here on the platform who are Republican and who have been dissuaded because of the lack of policy and dishonesty from what that party represents today. And I'm wondering if they use public media to indicate their displeasure with the inadequacies and the dishonesties of the party. And I also wonder if they're going to vote Democratic in this election so that they prevent a takeover of this country from the know-nothings.
Well, ma'am,
I guess-
I'm not going to say how I'm going to vote, but I can say I'm not going to vote for anyone who threatened to kill my kids. So that's not like a hard, that's not like a hard decision, but I can't, I wouldn't kind of say kind of where I am on that. But it's very easy, I think, to feel estranged as the party migrates in the direction it has. And it feels like every election cycle that goes by, there are fewer people within that party in a position to resist it. Cheney lost re-election. Kinzinger did not run for re-election. Most of the others who voted for impeachment lost re-election. So that's one of those things that I think is getting worse by the day, that there are fewer Republicans in positions of authority within the party every year that goes by. And after this election cycle, it'll be just a few left.
So your question had to do with whether Republicans like myself are using, or I particularly, using our voices in the public to, so yes. So in the presidential election, I did media in TV in favor of Biden. I wrote op-eds criticizing Trump and supporting Biden. I mentioned I raised $2 million for him. I organized 36 former Republican members of Congress for Biden. I stood next to him on the platform when he came to Bucks County. This year, I've made 3 television commercials for Democratic candidates for the state house in Bucks County, and did letters of endorsement and all of that stuff. And I put my vote where my mouth is as well.
One interesting thing that you see, and you see it with Cheney and you see it with everybody else, is every time we say anything, our influence is diminished. like the moment you start to cross that line, you're a rhino. You're not to be trusted as a Republican. So it's not like, despite your party affiliation, you don't maintain a certain level of influence. Every time you go at odds with it, every time you go at odds with lies about the election and all the rest, you become increasingly less influential, I think, and less compelling to people within the party. Well,
To indicate, I mean, there must be more Republicans who are dissatisfied with their party.
I'm not.
And they're not speaking out, I don't hear them.
And I'm not saying not to do it. I think it is a desperate situation and it's worth any sacrifice. That like is just because your influence diminishes doesn't mean you should, shut up and not do it.
And in my case, I had as a moderate Republican, I had a very significant following of the moderate Republicans in Bucks County. And even though I've been out of office for whatever it is, a long time now, there's many of them are still there. They still listen to what I have to say. And so I think it is helpful. There's a question is what Chrissy Todd Whitman and others have been trying to do some things in that regard. There's a party called Forward that has formed, and Chrissy Todd Whitman and Mr. Steele used to be the chairman of the Republican committee, and I think Yang and others are involved in that effort. They're endorsing candidates of both parties that they think are supporters of democracy.
As Mike runner and timekeeper, I should point out that we've gotten just about to the end of questions. Can I try a democratic experiment for a second? We'll have two choices. One is you let me ask one more question, or the other is that we have final remarks. I'm seeking consent to ask a question as the mic runner. If you would vote.
Go for it.
No, let's have a democratic experiment. Come on. Yeah, small d. Okay, opposed to the mic runner asking a final question. It's okay, please. Like, I know it's not
you're asking us to go against the person with the mic, right?
The solution is we'll let you ask the question, but we won't necessarily answer it.
And thank you, everyone. I think this was a beautiful experiment because you pointed out some of the problems with democracy. My final question to the panelists is about small scale democracy. We've been talking about big scale democracy, but do any of you have reflections either from your personal life or your professional life around the prospects of small scale democracy? Have you been on a jury? What was the democratic process like of being on a jury? Have you been a member of a union? What was your experience of that small scale democracy? Have you been a member of a food co-op in your neighborhood? You don't have to divulge too much, but I just want to say the final question is like, what are the prospects for our democratic culture beyond the political institutions that we've discussed tonight?
I think that's a great final question. I'm glad we gave it to you. I have a lot of faith in small d democracy. At the paper, I am in a union, and in Pittsburgh, the reporters in that union are striking right now. So our union has been talking and meeting a lot more than we ever have, and kind of talking about our values and what happens if the Pittsburgh paper wants to take our stories and how do we fight against that. And, coming together around a common cause is empowering. It's building community. Earlier when we were talking about kind of what happened in communities that Trump won over, I think a big part of it was when industry collapsed and unions shrunk. That community, those VFW halls, the folks who, would meet and have these common goals and maybe go to church together, all of that had such an impact on people feeling isolated and going to Facebook. And so to get back to the positive, I do think that I have faith in that. And the more we can find those spaces, the more important It's not a democracy, but I've been sort of, I cover politics all the time, and it's really nice to have the Phillies in the World Series because it's like, okay, something we can all get around.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight, and I want to thank the panel members for a really interesting and enlightening evening.